James Harper stood behind the register, his thick-rimmed glasses slipping down his nose, hands fumbling with a scanner that beeped like it had a mind of its own. To everyone in the Mason, Ohio, Harper's Market, he was just Eddie, the new guy. Rough stubble on his chin, a faded polo stretched over his broad shoulders, and a name tag pinned crooked on his chest. Nobody knew he was Jim Harper, the 55-year-old CEO who'd built this grocery chain from one dusty store in 1984 to 12 locations across the state. Nobody knew, and that was the point. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as an elderly woman shuffled up to his lane. Mrs. Eleanor Grayson. Jim caught her name later. Moved slow, her frail hands placing a loaf of bread, a can of soup, and a pack of butter on the conveyor belt like each one was a treasure. She had that look about her, the kind of quiet dignity that reminded Jim of his own grandma, counting pennies at the kitchen table. Then Tony Russo's voice cut through the hum of the store like a chainsaw. "Here we go again," Tony muttered, loud enough for half the checkout area to hear. He was a stocky guy, 48, with a permanent scowl etched into his face, hovering near Jim like some wannabe tough guy. These old folks should have their own damn store. Count in their pennies, holding up the line. He snorted, crossing his arms over his stained manager's vest. Jim froze, his finger hovering over the scanner. Mrs. Grayson flinched, her hands trembling as she dug into her purse, coins clinking against each other. "I'm sorry," she murmured, barely audible, her gray eyes darting down like she'd done something wrong. Tony rolled his eyes, his voice dripping with fake sweetness. "Take your time, ma'am. Not like anybody's got places to be." Then, under his breath, he added, "Geezers like her are a waste of space." Jim's stomach twisted into a knot. His jaw clenched so hard he thought his teeth might crack. This wasn't just rude. It was a gut punch to everything he'd built Harper's Market to be. Mrs. Grayson fumbled a nickel, and it rolled across the counter. Jim slid it back to her, forcing a calm he didn't feel. "No rush at all, ma'am," he said, his voice steady, warm. She gave him a shaky smile and shuffled off with her bag, but Jim's eyes locked on Tony, who just shook his head and muttered, "You'll learn, kid." Learn what? That this was how his company treated people now. The store wasn't much to look at these days. Shelves were half-stocked, the linoleum floor scuffed and dull, the air thick with tension you could feel more than see. Harper's Market used to be the heart of towns like Mason, a place where folks came not just for groceries, but for a friendly face, a quick chat. Jim had poured his soul into that idea back in 1984, starting with one little shop where he'd bag items himself, grinning at every customer like they were family. Now, 12 stores later, something was rotting. Complaints had been piling up, long lines, rude staff, and worst of all, whispers that elderly shoppers were getting pushed around. Corporate reports showed decent sales, but the numbers didn't tell him what he needed to know. He had to see it with his own eyes. That night, Jim sat in his quiet house on the edge of town, the kind of place that hadn't changed much since the 90s, wood-paneled walls, a recliner worn from years of use. On the coffee table sat a framed photo. Him, 30 years younger, standing proud in front of that first Harper's Market, a hand-painted sign gleaming in the sun. Back then, customers knew his name, thanked him for the little things, a clean store, a fair price, a bit of respect. Now, all he got were sterile emails and spreadsheets, cold as the winter wind outside. He ran a hand through his graying hair, staring at that picture. What if he'd let it all slip away? What if the company he'd built to serve people was turning into something he didn't recognize? Jim couldn't shake the image of Mrs. Grayson's trembling hands as he sat at his kitchen table the next morning, a lukewarm coffee mug in front of him. The reports on his laptop glowed with sterile numbers. Sales up 3%, inventory steady, but they didn't tell him why an old lady felt ashamed in his store. He scrolled through the latest batch of complaints. Cashiers rude as hell, lines out the door. Manager told my mom to shop somewhere else. That last one hit like a brick. Then his eyes landed on a handwritten note slipped into the stack. Mailed from Mason, the worst performing store in his chain. No name, just shaky ink. "Mr. Harper, we're falling apart down here. Nobody listens." That was it. The corporate suits could shove their spreadsheets. Jim needed the truth. and he wasn't going to get it from a corner office 50 miles away. He'd bill Harper's Market on his own sweat, on knowing every customer's face, and now he'd lost that. Enough was enough. He grabbed a razor, hacked his neat beard into rough stubble, and swapped his press suit for a pair of khakis and a polo that smelled like mothballs. Thick glasses from an old Halloween costume finished the look. He glanced in the mirror. Eddie, the nobody cashier, stared back. Perfect. Mason was a mid-sized store in a suburban sprawl, the kind of place where folks still waved at neighbors. If the rot was anywhere, it was there, and Jim was damn well going to find it. First day on the job hit him like a freight train. Karen Mitchell met him at the back door, her dark hair pulled into a messy bun, eyes ringed with exhaustion. She was 42, maybe, but looked older, like the weight of the place had aged her a decade. "You're Eddie, right?" she said, voice soft but frayed. "Stick to the register. Scan what you can. Machines freeze up sometimes, so don't panic." She hesitated, glancing toward the manager's office, a cramped box with a flickering light. "And if Tony says something, just ignore him." Jim nodded, catching the flicker of fear in her eyes. Not a good sign. He barely had time to adjust his name tag before the chaos started. The register beeped and stalled, customers grumbled, and Jim fumbled through it, keeping his head down. Then Tony Russo stomped out, all 5'6" of him, radiating attitude. Jim scanned a carton of eggs when Mrs. Grayson came back, her basket light as before. Tony hovered, watching her unfold a crumpled dollar bill. "Jesus, these seniors," he muttered, loud enough for Jim to hear. "Take forever. Ask dumb questions, should just stay home." Jim's blood boiled, but he kept his cool, ringing up her items slow and steady. "Take your time, ma'am," he said again, loud enough to counter Tony's sneer. She smiled, grateful, and shuffled off. Tony snorted. "You'll get tired of 'em, kid. They're a waste of time." That was the moment Jim knew. This wasn't just a bad day or a grumpy manager. Something was broken deep in his company, and Tony was the face of it. He couldn't just stand there scanning cans forever. He had to dig, watch, figure out how bad it really was. This wasn't about numbers anymore. It was about the soul of Harper's Market, the promise he'd made to every customer who walked through those doors. Tony strutted back to his office, oblivious, but Jim's mind was made up. He wasn't here to play cashier. He was here to take his company back, one ugly truth at a time. "Hey, folks." Jim's voice seemed to echo in his own head, like he was already rehearsing for something bigger. "If my undercover missions got you hooked, hit that like button, subscribe, and drop a comment. Would you snap at Tony right there or wait it out? I want to know what you think." Jim Harper, or Eddie, as the name tag said, stood behind the register, the scanner in his hand buzzing like a ticked-off hornet. Day 2 at the Mason Harper's Market, and he was already wrestling with a machine older than half the staff. The screen flickered, froze, then spat out an error code he didn't understand. A guy in a flannel shirt waiting for his beer sighed, loud enough to wake the dead. "Come on, man, I ain't got all day." Jim muttered an apology, jabbing buttons until the damn thing beeped back to life. He wasn't cut out for this. Not anymore. Not after 30 years calling the shots from a cushy office. But he wasn't here to be good at it. He was here to see what the hell was going on. Karen Mitchell hovered nearby, her tired eyes darting between Jim and the line piling up. She leaned in, voice low. "Hit the reset key under the counter if it locks again. Happens all the time." She forced a thin smile, but her hands shook as she handed him a stack of coupons to scan. Up close, Jim saw the lines etched deep around her eyes. 42, going on 60, worn down by this place. "Thanks," he said, keeping it casual. She nodded and hustled off, juggling a spilled bag of apples and a customer yelling about expired milk. Jim watched her go, piecing it together. Karen wasn't lazy. She was drowning, and nobody was throwing her a line. Every cashier flinched when Tony Russo's shadow passed by. Every stock clerk moved like they were dodging a landmine. This wasn't a team. This was a bunch of scared folks trying not to get noticed. The real gut punch came an hour later. Mrs. Eleanor Grayson was back. Same slow shuffle, same small basket, bread, soup, a couple apples this time. Jim gave her a nod, keeping it easy. She smiled back, frail but warm, like she appreciated the little things. Tony Russo didn't. He stomped up behind Jim, arms crossed, watching her unfold a dollar bill like it was a personal insult. "They count pennies and waste my time," he grumbled, loud enough for Mrs. Grayson to hear. Her shoulders stiffened, her fingers fumbling the coins. "I'm sorry," she whispered, voice cracking as a dime slipped to the floor. Tony smirked, leaning closer to Jim. "These old-timers hold up the line. Ask dumb questions. Should just shop online or something." Jim's hands tightened on the scanner till his knuckles went white. Mrs. Grayson's face flushed red, her eyes dropping like she wanted to disappear. He could have decked Tony right there, 55 years old and still ready to throw a punch for a lady who didn't deserve this. But he didn't. Not yet. He swallowed the rage, kept his voice steady. "Take your time, ma'am," he said, sliding her dime back across the counter. She looked up, grateful, and Jim bagged her stuff slow and careful, making damn sure she felt human. Tony snorted and wandered off, muttering, "Waste of time." Jim's heart pounded. This wasn't just one jerk with a big mouth. This was the guy running his store, spitting on everything Harper's Market stood for. The shift dragged on, and Jim started seeing the cracks everywhere. He caught a break in the employee lounge, really just a corner with a wobbly table and a coffee pot that smelled like burnt tar. A schedule taped to the wall told a story he didn't like. Karen's name ran across every day, 12-hour shifts stacked like bricks. Mike Torres, a quiet stock clerk with a limp, had 3 measly shifts that week, scattered like crumbs. Jenny Brooks, a cashier with gray streaks in her hair and a voice that didn't take crap, was down to 2 days, same as last week. Jim overheard her muttering to Mike by the fridge. "Tony cuts me again 'cause I don't kiss his ass." Meanwhile, his buddies get 40 hours, no sweat. Mike just nodded, staring at his boots. Jim's gut churned. This wasn't random. Tony was playing favorites, screwing over the old-timers and the quiet ones. Folks like Karen, Jenny, Mike, who didn't bow and scrape. He leaned against the wall, pretending to sip the awful coffee, watching the room. Karen rushed past Tony's office, a mop in hand, cleaning up a spill she didn't make. Tony barked through the door. "What the hell you running around for?" "Manage, don't mop." She froze, nodded quick, and kept going. Jim's jaw tightened. Tony wasn't just a bully. He was a damn dictator, and this store was his little kingdom. What else was this guy hiding behind that closed door? Jim Harper kept his head down, bagging Mrs. Eleanor Grayson's groceries with a care he hadn't felt in years. The scanner beeped steady now, a small victory against the junk machine. She'd lingered after paying, her shaky hands clutching the cart, and Jim saw his chance. "Let me get that for you, ma'am," he said, stepping around the counter before Tony Russo could open his big mouth again. He pushed the cart out to the parking lot, the Ohio wind cutting through his thin polo. Mrs. Grayson shuffled beside him, her coat buttoned tight against the chill. They stopped by her beat-up sedan, a 1990-something Buick with a dented fender. She popped the trunk, and Jim loaded her stuff, bread, soup, apples, like it was a job, not just a cover. "Thank you, young man," she said, her voice soft but clear. "I've been coming here since your boss was a kid working the counter." Jim froze for half a second, then caught himself. She didn't know who he was, but that hit deep. "You mean Mr. Harper?" he asked, playing dumb. She nodded, a faint smile crinkling her eyes. "Jimmy, we called him. Always had a kind word. Made this place feel like home. Ain't the same now, but you're a good one." Jim's chest tightened. He mumbled a thanks, watching her drive off, that Buick rattling down the road. Back inside, the store noise swallowed him up again, but her words stuck like glue. This place could still be saved. Folks like Mrs. Grayson hadn't given up on it, even if Tony had. For a minute, Jim felt a flicker of hope, like the old days weren't gone for good. He'd built Harper's Market to mean something, damn it, and maybe it wasn't too late to fight for that. That hope took a hit later in the employee lounge. Jim slumped in a plastic chair, pretending to scroll his phone, the coffee pot hissing in the corner. Jenny Brooks and Mike Torres huddled by the fridge, their voices low but sharp. Jenny, 50 and fed up, cracked open a soda. "Tony's at it again," she said, her gray-streaked ponytail bouncing as she shook her head. "Cut my hours down to nothing, but his buddy Greg's got full shifts every week. I heard he's pushing out the old crew, folks like us, so he can bring in his own people." Mike, leaning on the counter, rubbed his bad knee. Yeah, saw him chewing out Karen yesterday for asking about it. Guy's a damn snake. Jim's ears perked up, his grip tightening on the phone. This wasn't just Tony being a jerk, it was a pattern, a power play. He glanced at the schedule again, seeing it clear now. Jenny, Mike, the older ones, the quiet ones, all squeezed out while Tony's pals raked in hours. The guy wasn't just mismanaging, he was rigging the game. Jim's mind raced. How long had this been going on under his nose? How many good people had walked away because he'd been too busy signing checks to notice? This was bigger than one bad store. It was a crack in the whole damn foundation of Harper's Market. That night, alone in his house, Jim couldn't sit still. He paced the living room, the wood floor creaking under his boots. Tony's sneering face flashed in his head. Those snide cracks about Mrs. Grayson, the way he'd crushed Karen's spirit. Jim stopped by the coffee table, staring at that old photo of himself outside the first store. 1984, grinning like a fool, full of big dreams about treating folks right. Now, he'd let a guy like Tony run wild, let his people, his customers, his workers, take the hit. How long I'd been asleep at the wheel, he muttered to the empty room. He sank into the recliner, rubbing his temples. The truth gnawed at him. He wasn't just mad at Tony, he was mad at himself. He'd built this company on respect, on service, and somewhere along the line, he'd handed the keys to a bully. Mrs. Grayson's voice echoed. Jimmy always had a kind word. What would she think of him now, letting her get humiliated in his own store? Jim's stomach churned. He wasn't some bystander here. He'd let this rot spread, and that made him part of the mess. Could he really face that? Look himself in the mirror and own it? Jim Harper was back behind the register the next morning, still playing Eddie, but his hands moved on autopilot now. The scanner beeped, the line shuffled, but his head was somewhere else, reeling from what he'd overheard about Tony Russo rigging the store for his cronies. He kept his eyes on the floor, watching, waiting, knowing the deeper he dug, the uglier it'd get. Then it hit, right in the middle of a quiet shift, like a bomb he didn't see coming. Karen Mitchell staggered out from the back, her face pale, a clipboard shaking in her hands. She'd been on since dawn, another 12-hour grind, and Tony was tailing her, his voice booming across the store. What the hell's this, Karen? You whining about the schedule again? She stopped near the dairy aisle, turning to him, her voice barely holding steady. I just asked for a day off, Tony. I've been covering every shift. Greg's out, Ginny's cut. I can't keep. Tony cut her off, stepping in close, his finger jabbing the air. Quit crying. You're paid to manage. I don't give a damn if you're tired. Figure it out. Jim's heart slammed against his ribs. Karen's shoulders slumped, her eyes glistening, but she bit her lip and nodded, like she'd heard it all before. Tony smirked, smug as hell, and strutted back to his office. Jim caught a glimpse of something else. Karen slipping a crumpled note into her pocket, her hands trembling worse than Mrs. Grayson's. Later, when he passed the stockroom, he saw why. A stack of boxes marked expired sat in the corner, but the dates were fine. Tony'd been swapping them out, selling stuff under the table to pad his own pockets, then blaming the crew for shortages. Jim's blood ran cold. This wasn't just bullying, it was theft, right under his nose, and Karen was taking the fall for it. The stakes just shot through the roof. By late afternoon, the store felt like a pressure cooker ready to blow. Jim clocked out for a break, heading to the employee lounge to catch his breath. He didn't make it 2 steps inside before he heard Karen's voice crack through the thin walls. She was in there with Jenny Brooks, the door half open, her back to him. I can't keep doing this, Karen said, her words breaking apart like glass. He's going to fire me if I push back, but I'm dead on my feet, Jenny. I haven't slept more than 4 hours in days. Jenny, sitting at the wobbly table, reached out a hand. You're not alone, hon. We're all drowning. Tony's turned this place into a damn nightmare. Jim stood frozen outside, his fist clenched tight. Karen sank into a chair, her head in her hands, sobs shaking her shoulders. I tried to fix it. I told him the schedule's a mess. The shortages aren't our fault. He just laughed, said I'm too soft. I don't know how much more I can take. Jenny's voice hardened. He's a bastard, Karen. We quit if we could, but where else are we going to go? Jim's chest felt like it had caved in. He was still Eddie to them, just some new guy who couldn't step in and stop this. He'd built Harper's Market to lift people up, not break them down. And here was Karen, loyal, hard-working Karen, falling apart because he'd let Tony run wild. The room went quiet, just the sound of Karen's ragged breathing cutting through. Jim backed off, his boots silent on the linoleum, but his mind screamed. This was the lowest he'd felt since he walked in. Watching his people suffer, powerless in his own damn store. Tony wasn't just a bad manager. He was a wrecking ball, and Jim had handed him the keys. Could he rip off the mask right now, storm in there, and end it? Or did he need more proof, more time, to make sure Tony went down for good? Jim Harper drove home that night, the Mason store's flickering lights fading in his rearview mirror. Karen's broken sobs still rang in his ears, louder than the hum of his old pickup. He'd stood there, useless, watching her fall apart. 42 years old, tougher than most, and Tony Russo had ground her down to nothing. Jim's hands gripped the wheel so hard his knuckles ached. He'd built Harper's Market to mean something. Respect, service, a place folks could count on, and now it was a damn cage for people like Karen, Jenny, and Mrs. Grayson. How the hell had he let it get this bad? He pulled into his driveway, the house dark except for a porch light buzzing with moths. Inside, he didn't bother with the lights, just sank into that worn recliner, the one his dad used to sit in back when Jim was a kid dreaming big. The old man's voice came back to him, gravelly and sure, from a day long gone. Respect ain't given, Jimmy. It's earned every damn day. Jim's eyes drifted to the photo on the coffee table. Him in 1984, grinning outside that first store full of fire. His dad had been there, clapping him on the back, proud as hell. You treat folks right, this'll last forever, he'd said. Forever didn't feel like this. Jim leaned back, staring at the ceiling. Tony's smirk, Karen's tears, Mrs. Grayson's shaky hands. They swirled in his head like a bad dream he couldn't shake. But something clicked, slow and steady, like a match catching flame. He wasn't helpless here. He wasn't just Eddie, the new guy fumbling with a scanner. He was Jim Harper, the man who'd built this company from nothing, and he still had the power to fix it. Not with reports or memos, but with his own two hands, the way he'd started. He sat up, jaw set. Tony wasn't going to win this. Not on his watch. By morning, Jim was a different man. He stood in his kitchen, coffee brewing, staring out at the gray Ohio dawn. The fog in his head was gone, replaced with a plan as clear as the frost on the grass. He wasn't going back to Mason as Eddie today. He was going back as Jim Harper, CEO, and he was done playing nice. He grabbed his phone and dialed his assistant, Linda, a no-nonsense woman who'd been with him since the 90s. Linda, he said when she picked up, voice steady as steel. Clear my day. I need everything you've got on Tony Russo, employee file, complaints, schedules, all of it. And give me sales record for the Mason store, last 6 months. Linda didn't miss a beat. You finally digging into that mess, huh? I'll have it by noon. Anything else? Jim paced, glancing at that 1984 photo again. Yeah, call the regional manager. Tell him to stand by. I'm handling this myself, but I'll need backup after. She chuckled, dry as ever. About time, boss. I'll get it done. He hung up, already mapping it out. Tony was the rot, but Karen, she was the heart holding that store together. He'd seen her grit, her quiet strength, even when she was breaking. She'd been running the place despite Tony, not because of him. Jim wasn't going to let her carry it alone anymore. He pulled on his coat, the real one, not the thrift store junk he'd worn as Eddie, and grabbed his keys. Today wasn't about watching from the shadows. Today was about taking back what was his, fixing what he'd let break. Tony thought he ran that store, but Jim was about to show him who really called the shots. Jim Harper walked into the Mason Harper's Market just after the morning rush, his real coat swapped back for the thrift store polo one last time. The disguise wouldn't last much longer. He could feel it in his bones. The store hummed with its usual chaos. Registers beeping, carts rattling, Tony Russo's voice barking at Mike Torres over by the canned goods. Karen Mitchell stood behind the counter, her face drawn tight, eyes red like she hadn't slept. Jim took a deep breath, steeling himself. This was it. He strode straight for Tony's office, the cramped little box with its flickering light, and pushed the door open without knocking. Tony looked up from his desk, a half-eaten donut in hand, crumbs on his vest. "What the hell you think you're doing, kid?" he snapped, his scowl deepening. "Get back to your register before I write you up." Jim shut the door behind him, the click loud in the tiny room. He pulled off the thick glasses, tossed the Eddie name tag on the desk, and locked eyes with Tony. "I'm not going anywhere," he said, voice low and firm. "I'm Jim Harper. I own this company." The color drained from Tony's face like someone yanked the plug. His mouth opened, then shut, donuts slipping to the desk. You're, he stammered. Jim didn't let him finish. He stepped forward, hands planted on the desk, leaning in close. "I've been here 2 days, Tony, and I'm disgusted. I heard you mock old ladies like Mrs. Grayson, watch you run Karen into the ground, saw you cut hours for good people like Jenny and Mike while your buddies rake it in. And don't get me started on those expired boxes you're selling out the back." Tony's eyes widened, a flicker of panic breaking through his tough guy act. "Sir, save it." Jim cut him off, voice like a blade. "You think this is about keeping things moving? You've turned my store into a damn circus, scaring my crew, humiliating my customers. I built this place on respect, and you've been pissing all over it." Tony's jaw tightened, his bravado kicking back in. "With all due respect, you don't know what it's like down here. I do what I gotta do to keep this dump running." Jim's eyes narrowed. "You call that running? I call it disgrace. And I'm ending it now." Tony leaned back, crossing his arms, trying to play it cool. "Look, corporate's been on my ass to cut costs. Push harder, make more with less. I didn't start this." Jim froze for a split second. That was the twist he hadn't seen coming. Corporate pressure? His own people up top might have lit this fire, but it didn't change a damn thing. "Doesn't matter," Jim said, voice steady again. "You chose how to handle it, and you chose wrong. You're done. Get your stuff and get out." Tony's face went red, his mouth twisting. "You can't just—" "I can," Jim snapped. "And I did. Go." Tony glared, but Jim's stare didn't budge. Finally, he grabbed his coat, muttering curses, and stormed out, slamming the door so hard the frame shook. Jim stepped in the main store, employees turning heads as Tony stomped toward the exit. "Good luck without me." Tony sneered over his shoulder. "This place'll fall apart. You'll see." The glass doors swung shut behind him, and silence fell heavy. Karen stood frozen at the register, hands gripping the counter. Jenny and Mike peeked out from the aisles wide-eyed. Jim cleared his throat, stepping forward. "Listen up, everybody. I know this is a shock, but I've got something to say. I'm Jim Harper, the owner, and I've been working here undercover to see what's really going on. What I saw, it ends today." Gasps rippled through the crew. Karen's mouth dropped open, then shut quick. Jim turned to her. "Karen, you've been holding this place together while Tony tore it apart. I'm making you interim manager, effective now." Her eyes widened, hands trembling. "Me?" she whispered. "You?" Jim said, firm but warm. "You've earned it." He faced the others, Jenny, Mike, the rest. "Schedules are going to be fair. No more favoritism, no more overworking. And respect? That's mandatory for you and every customer who walks in, starting with folks like Mrs. Grayson." A week later, Jim was back, not as Eddie, but as himself, sleeves rolled up, helping restock shelves. The air felt lighter, the crew moving with purpose instead of fear. Mrs. Grayson shuffled in, same small basket, and Jim met her at the register. "Good to see you, ma'am," he said, bagging her bread and soup with a grin. She smiled back, brighter than before. "You're a good one, young man." He chuckled, just trying to make things right. That moment, her smile, the store humming again, closed the loop on the nightmare he'd walked into. Sitting in his truck that night, Jim stared out at the darkening sky. He'd fix Mason, sure, but what about the rest? Could he keep this promise? Keep Harper's Market true to what he'd built back in 1984? Respect wasn't just a word. It was the backbone of everything he had. He'd damn well make sure it stayed that way. But how many other CEOs out there would do the same? Put their boots on the ground, fight for what's right? That question lingered, heavy and open like the road ahead. "Hey folks," he imagined saying, a grin tugging at his lips. "Thanks for sticking with my journey. Subscribe for more stories like this, hit that like button, and tell me, what would you do if you were in my shoes? I'm reading every comment, so let's hear it.